Well, the 2008 case, the Heller case, I mean, they upheld what you're saying. And one of the things I am a fan of about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is it seems that there is this built-in elasticity to those documents in which, or I would like to think, that the forefathers realize that, hey, listen, over time this is going to have to change and it will need to be adaptable. But I also understand where people do get a bit stickler about it and say, well, wait a minute, if they meant that, why did they not say that in more direct language? But that brings up the idea, you mentioned the Fourth Amendment, and then the 14th Amendment as well kind of clarifies that. Talk about the 14th Amendment in a little bit for us.
Well, one of the things, if we're talking about the Constitution's protection of the right to bear arms, we shouldn't just talk about the Second Amendment, we should also talk about the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was added right after the Civil War. It was one of 3 amendments added after the Civil War to try to reconstruct our country. And what the 14th Amendment says is no state shall deny to any person effectively equal protection of the laws or due process of laws. And the framers of the 14th Amendment argued that the amendment was necessary to keep the southern states, even after they were brought back into the fold after the Civil War, from denying the rights of the freedmen. One of the rights that the freedmen were denied was the right to have guns. You know, in the South, blacks had never been able to own guns before the Civil War. A lot of African Americans gained access to guns during the Civil War, either fighting for the Union Army, which had black units, and the Union Army allowed people to keep their guns after they left the Army. And for blacks returning to the South, you took your gun with you. You knew the kind of hostility that was waiting for you. And the southern states, in an effort to try to reestablish white supremacy, passed laws restricting the rights of African Americans, including laws requiring them to give up their guns. The KKK formed right after the Civil War to go out at night, terrorize black homes. One of the first things the KKK did was target gun owners among the black community. They wanted to get the guns out of the hands of African Americans because without guns, it was going to be a lot harder to fight back for African Americans. So the framers of the 14th Amendment said, we need an amendment that's going to protect the fundamental rights of the freedmen. And they said specifically, among other rights, the right of the people to keep and bear arms for personal protection against marauders like the Klansmen. So part of the intent and understanding of the 14th Amendment was to protect the right of the freedmen to have guns for personal protection.
Understood. And then even beyond the Bill of Rights, we have, you mentioned, most states, I believe 43 of 50 states, within their constitutions, there are provisions that protect gun ownership. Can you talk about that a little bit?
For all of the debate over the meaning of the Second Amendment and its ambiguity, the right to bear arms has never relied exclusively on the Second Amendment for protection in American law. As you said, 43 of the 50 states have provisions in their state constitutions that say clearly that there is a right of the people to keep and bear arms. And unlike the Second Amendment, which has only just recently been interpreted by the Supreme Court, these state constitutional provisions have cases interpreting them going all the way back to the 1820s. And what we find is that going all the way back, we find a pretty consistent pattern where courts have interpreted these provisions not to protect just some militia, but to protect an individual's right to have a gun for personal protection. And of course, it wouldn't make much sense in a state constitution to protect a right for the state to have a militia against federal interference. A state constitution can't control what the federal government does.
One of the premises that you put forth in the book is that, because a lot of people think, oh, well, gun control, we need gun control. But in fact, gun control has been a historical part of our story of guns in America. Talk about that, because I think a lot of people are not aware of that. They think that they picture just this Wild West environment for 200 some odd years.
That's right, and we have this sort of image that we have a right to bear arms and the Second Amendment means you can't have gun control. I think that's totally wrong. I think the Second Amendment puts some limits on gun control, to be sure. All our constitutional amendments do that. But the history of guns in America is not just a history of the Second Amendment and the six-shooter. It's a history also of efforts to balance public safety with gun rights. And so the Founding Fathers had gun control. They barred people from having guns if they didn't trust them. Slaves most notably, but also free blacks and even law-abiding white people who refused to swear an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. That is to say, political dissenters who didn't like the idea of a revolution. They were subject to forcible disarmament. The founders made gun owners show up at mandatory musters where their guns would be registered on public rolls. because the country needed those guns in the event of war, and if you didn't show up to serve, your gun would be seized. If we go all the way through American history, we see the same pattern. The Wild West, considered maybe the heart of America's gun culture. You know, we have that image of the gunslinger walking through town with the 6 shooters on each hip.
John Wayne, high noon, man.
John Wayne, high noon. But the truth is frontier towns on the Wild West had the most restrictive gun control laws in the nation.
Explain.
Well, so if you went into a town like Dodge City, Kansas, or Tombstone, Arizona, they had restrictions on people's ability to carry guns in public. So everyone had guns in the Wild West. You know, if you're going from place to place out in the untamed wilderness, you had to worry about bandits, you had to worry about native tribes that might be hostile, wild animals. You had a gun. You needed personal protection. But when you came into a frontier town like Dodge City, or Tombstone, Arizona, you had to check your gun with the marshal. And you'd get a little token. And you could use that token when you left the town to get your gun back. And in fact, Dodge City, Kansas, a famous gunslinger town, the very first law they passed in 1873 when they formed their municipal government, a gun control law banning the carrying of concealed weapons. And often these towns broaden those prohibitions to apply to openly carried weapons too.